Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
Minnesota's most prominent public building, the beautiful state capitol, offers a showcase of grand architecture, beautiful art, and amazing history, including irreplaceable artifacts from the Civil War. We'll bring some of it to life on this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. When the Minnesota State Capitol was completed in 1906, the battle scars of the Civil War were still fresh in people's minds. Featuring Minnesota's involvement in that war was of great importance to the building's planners. On this week's program, we will show you many of the artifacts that remain on display, and we begin with the large statues on the Capitol's second floor. Capitol architect Gilbert designed the second floor of the Capitol Rotunda with 4 alcoves to be filled at a later date, and they have been filled with statues of Civil War heroes. Can you tell us about the first one that comes to mind?
Yeah, the second floor niches were designed in Gilbert's mind to be for senators or famous presidents from Minnesota and so forth, and these became the second generation of Civil War art is the statues. And so one very prominent statue you'll see in the second floor is William Colville, who was a colonel from the 1st Minnesota Infantry. And his role, his claim to fame, was leading the men of the 1st Minnesota at the charge at Gettysburg, where they lost 82% of their men. He was wounded twice there, and so it was one of those things that he survived those wounds, became one of the renowned war heroes of Minnesota, and became an attorney general after the war. He also served in the House of Representatives. He was like a land commissioner up in northeastern Minnesota, and so there's a little township, or a little town, Colville it's called, and that's part of his legacy. But he lived in Red Wing, so that's where he was coming to St. Paul, Minneapolis and St. Paul, for the big Grand Day celebration of the flags being moved from the second Capitol to the brand new Capitol. So he was going to be one of the guests of honor. And he was staying at the Veterans Home in Minneapolis, which was not uncommon for veterans to find a place to stay when they're in the Twin Cities. And he passed away in his sleep 2 days before that big event took place.
And he was the first to be laid in state in the state capitol.
That's correct. He was the first person, Minnesotan, to be laid in state in the Capitol. And it was a very poignant part of that remembrance of the the Flagbearers and the Civil War veterans and those flags being brought to the Capitol, but his body was in state right in the center of the rotunda, and so those Flagbearers, as they marched into the building, marched by his casket as part of that final tribute to this great war hero.
Alexander Wilkinson, why was he here, and why is he the only one of the 4 statues to have the tree stump with the oak leaves next to him?
Yeah, he was one of the highest ranking officers from the state of Minnesota to be killed in the Civil War. So the symbolism of that cut down oak tree is that's in cemeteries, or it's often referring to a man who was cut down in his prime. Just like the strong oak is cut down, you have this loss, this tremendous strength and authority that's disappeared because of that death. Alexander Wilkinson was from St. Paul, an attorney. He was a U.S. Marshal here. He also was one of the first secretaries of the territory from the early 1850s, 1851 to 1853. And so he had established himself here as a pretty strong St. Paul resident, was a landowner and so forth. He started an insurance company that eventually became Travelers
yes.
Insurance Company
Yes.
today. And so he's the father and the creator of that big corporation. And then you also have Wilkinson County was named in honor of him to remember his Civil War sacrifice as a Minnesotan in that war.
John Sanborn both began his career and ended his career in state politics, first as a member of the House and Senate. He was one of the first legislators to write the laws for the state, and then went back into politics at the end of his career and fought in the Civil War in between. Talk more about John Sanborn.
Yeah, he was a pretty interesting person in St. Paul's history. He was a lawyer, had a pretty strong established firm. He, in fact, had already, by the time of the Civil War, had addressed the Supreme Court in 4 different cases. So people were asking him for his services. He became a state senator. When the war began, was given the responsibility to be the adjutant general. So it was his job to organize all of the Minnesota units that were going to be sent out to fight in the Civil War. So he raised the first 4 infantry regiments. He put a couple of artillery units together, cavalry units. So there were 11 units that he had helped get armed, equipped, trained at Fort Snelling to send out to fight. And eventually, because of his role in doing that, he was given the colonelcy, or becoming the leader, the commander of the 4th Minnesota Infantry.
I read that he was well respected by many tribal leaders. They called him Black Whiskers, and along with Kit Carson, he was responsible for negotiating some treaties. Is that correct?
Yeah. They were some peace councils and some treaties that he was a part of in the 1860s, 1867 and 68. So he served in the military after the Civil War for several years. And what's remarkable about him is he was, as we mentioned, a state senator and a House member and a pretty well-known attorney in the city. But if you go to his grave in Oakland Cemetery in St. Paul, you'll see in this big monument of his, it's General Sanborn. So I think that was something he was very proud of throughout his life, serving in the Civil War. He served before he died as the president of the Minnesota Historical Society. We have a lot of his Civil War accoutrements and equipment that he donated to the museum. And so once again, his legacy is important in the state capitol because of his role in the Civil War.
Let's turn to Major General James Shields, who had a storied history. He was born in Ireland, and he served as a U.S. Senator from 3 different states. What are some other highlights of his career?
Yeah, his statue was placed here, the last of the 4 statues in 1914, and his claim to Minnesota's fame is he was our first U.S. Senator along with Henry Rice. So at that time, you have to remember that those senators were elected from the legislative bodies and state houses or state capitals. And so he was not the favored candidate, but they couldn't decide, they didn't get enough votes to swing one candidate above the other. And so they brought him as kind of a dark horse candidate, a kind of a compromise candidate, and became our first senator. He only served for about a year. And then he was active all over the place. So he, before he came to Minnesota, was a Supreme Court justice in Illinois, was their state auditor.
And didn't he challenge Abraham Lincoln to a duel? And what's the story behind that?
Yeah, in 1842, this young up-and-coming legislator from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, was, and they think Mary Todd might have also had a role in that. They were writing scathing editorials in the newspaper in Springfield, besmirching the credibility and the ability of James Shields. And so Shields wanted to have the satisfaction of knowing who was sending these editorials in the paper, and he eventually finds out it was Abraham Lincoln. So he challenged Abraham Lincoln to a duel. And because Lincoln was challenged, he got to choose his weapons, and the weapon was broadswords. And so they actually went to Missouri, because they couldn't duel legally in Illinois, to fight this duel. And at the last minute, the second stepped in and canceled that duel. So,
and then they became friends, correct?
They had, I don't know if they were like come on over for supper kind of friends, but they had a professional respect and a mutual respect after that time.
And I believe also for his service in a prior war, the Mexican-American War, he was awarded land in Minnesota, and he established the town of Shieldsville, and also was responsible for bringing a lot of Irish immigrants from the East Coast to Minnesota.
Right, and that was the reason why he was here when Minnesota was becoming a state. He had established these small Irish immigrant communities, helped establish Faribault, Minnesota. So he was, a pretty well-known person.
You mentioned that Cass Gilbert had designed these niches to be used for state senators or other people of state importance, and yet they were filled with Civil War heroes. Would he have approved of that?
Yeah, he was alive when this took place, and I haven't seen a lot of information or letters he was saying that's the worst idea ever, but I think he had envisioned something different than what we have. But once again, it gives you the idea of the importance of the Civil War when this building opened. This is only one decade removed from when this building opened that these statues were all placed here. And so once again, it's really us being able to tell that story of what this building was about. Not only are the laws made here, but you have this important part of our story of Minnesota's involvement in the Civil War throughout the entire state capitol building.
In a grand ceremony, Minnesota veterans of the Civil War marched behind their battle flags as they moved from the state's second state capitol in downtown St. Paul to the new building on the hill. Recently, many of those flags were restored. Historian Brian Pease explains more. Minnesota began a tradition of displaying battle flags after the Battle of Bull Run in 1861, and there was a huge public ceremony in 1905 to bring the battle flags that were in the collection from the old Capitol to the new Capitol in 1905. What have these flags been doing since then?
Well, that's an important part of Minnesota's history in recognizing the Minnesota men's involvement in the Civil War. So by virtue of putting the first battle flag on display in the first Capitol, you set that tradition and that sense of honor and pride to display those flags that these men were dying under as a part of that tradition in Minnesota. So when those old veterans back in 1905 were coming with their flags tightly wrapped around the Flagstaff up to this brand new Capitol, this was a great sense of pride and honor, because thousands of people came out in this parade to watch, probably for a lot of these men the last time they ever marched under their flag.
The flags were housed in these display cases, all wound up in tatters. And then in the 60s, there was an effort to unfurl them so that you could see them more as they would have been on the battlefield. What was the story behind that?
Yeah, what was happening, you're getting to the centennial of the Civil War in the 1960s. And so if you were to walk by these cases in the 1960s, you would have seen pieces of the flag on the floor in the case. So they were deteriorating. And it didn't help that they were tightly wrapped around those flagstaffs. And so in 1963 and 1964, Tom Welter from St. Paul was hired to conserve the flags. And so he was very innovative. There weren't a lot of people in the United States conserving flags at that time, so he took it upon himself to design a special sewing machine that would put zigzag stitching so you can encapsulate the original silk in between silk crepeline and then keep all the pieces together, and then you could hang it from a flagstaff unfurled so you could start seeing elements of those flags once again revealed.
So you could really see the flag hanging on the pole. But at some point, 2009, I think, they came to look as they look now. What's the story behind that?
What we were doing is we were always looking at the flags, and we could see where the zigs and the zags were taking place in those unfurled flags. You had more separation taking place of the fabric, and that kept all the pieces together, but gravity was really taking a toll. They had been on display for decades, and so you were seeing fading patterns in the kind of the top of the flag. So we really wanted to make sure we preserve these very important artifacts of Minnesota's history. So the Minnesota Historical Society took the lead in conserving the flags, taking them off those flag staffs or the flag poles, and then mounting them flat on specially designed panels. So now we can have those flags on display flat. And we had mentioned before, some of those flags had never been seen unfurled before. Well, for probably 150 years, some of these flags had never been seen flat before.
How many flags are in the collection, and how often do they rotate?
Yeah, there's 59 that are part of this collection. There's others that are part of the Minnesota Historical Society collection, and we rotate in over time 48 different flags. Some of the flags that are part of the collection are just very small remnants, so there's not really a lot to see, and we want to protect those historic relics, just keep them under darkness as much as possible. So every 8 to 9 months we have 4 new flags that we rotate in. We try to equal the number of regimental flags and national colors. And of the 4 display cases here too, we do have a flag case for the Spanish-American War, because those flags were also transferred to this brand new Capitol in 1905.
I read that some of the bravest men in the Civil War were those that carried the colors. They marched 6 paces in front of their regiment and were basically the steering wheel for their men.
Yeah, it was, for those colorbearers, that was a sense of pride and honor, because they were selected among the regiment. They were some of the most popular, the most physical, the most respected men, because you're carrying those flags for a purpose, and that's to protect those flags and to make them very visible during campaigns or battles as you're marching into battle or in battle. And so to carry that color, not only were you helping control the direction of the unit as it's going into battle or retreating out of battle, but you also put yourself as a big target, because each side was trying to shoot down those color bearers, because they were, once again, a communication device. And so for those men fighting around those flags, that's representing their nation. That's what they're fighting for, preserving the Union. or they're fighting with their regimental color, their state color, fighting for their home, fighting for what they believe is an important part of their participation in the Civil War.
Do you have a favorite flag?
Well, the one behind us is the flag from the 4th Minnesota Infantry Regiment, and as far as we know, this probably saw a lot of service as in their campaign to Vicksburg. And so once again, that Flagstaff was being held by those color-bearers, and you can imagine through all those miles of marching and battles, there's the blood, the stains, the sweat, the tears, the dirt, all that history is part of that story. And so when you look at each of these flags, they might not have seen a lot of service, but they were important parts of Minnesota's history and what these men were fighting for.
One of the most unique Civil War artifacts on display in the state capitol is a flagstaff that barely survived the Battle of Gettysburg and now symbolizes the joining of the North and the South. Brian Pease has more. We're standing here outside the Capitol Rotunda next to the flagstaff from the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which is one of the most important artifacts in Minnesota history from the Civil War. Can you talk about the significance of this flagstaff?
Sure. Once again, it's a relic of the Civil War. Men from Minnesota were carrying this flag in months before the Civil War battle took place at Gettysburg, but more importantly, it was kind of held front and center on the second day when they made their famous charge down Cemetery Ridge, and on the third day at Pickett's Charge.
As a transplant to the state of Minnesota, I was surprised to learn how important Minnesota's regiment was in the Battle of Gettysburg. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, the second day of the battle, the Union line was about a mile in front of where the 1st Minnesota troops were located. And as the battle was progressing in front of them, the Union line started to crumble. Men were running through their ranks of the 1st Minnesota who were protecting a section of artillery pieces. And a general, understanding the consequence of men retreating in front of them, said, I need to plug that gap. And the 1st Minnesota was the closest group of soldiers available. So he had them fix bayonets, charge down to plug that gap in the Union line. And as they made that charge, about a 300-yard charge, they jogged the first couple hundred yards and then ran full tilt into Confederate forces advancing. They could see they were overwhelmed, and that's exactly what happened to them. So on that second day, within 15 minutes, they lost about 82% of their men. 8 of every 10 of them were killed or wounded.
On that third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, so we're talking about July 3rd of 1863, that's where the staff came from. Can you tell the story of the staff?
As the Confederate forces were advancing up Cemetery Ridge, the color-bearer, Corporal Dane, was holding the flag. He was shot through the hand that splintered the flagstaff, the Union flagstaff, in half. He dropped the flag because of his wounds, and Henry O'Brien, who was next to him, picked up that flag, and he, having only the bottom half was already shattered, he snapped that off and threw it aside, and then he started advancing toward the advancing Confederates. Well, for our soldiers, this flag was one of the most important things you're fighting for, because the worst thing that could ever happen to a regiment is to lose your colors. And so if you see that color moving forward, you have to protect that man and that color, and that's what these men from Minnesota did. They charged after their flag, ended up hitting the 20th Virginia Infantry, that was the opposing side, and for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, it was just a hand-to-hand slugfest, throwing, fists at each other, rocks, clubbing each other with their muskets, and so it was right in the heart of that big Pickett's Charge that these 1st Minnesota men were right in the middle of that melee. And by the end of that, those men surrendered or retreated. The 20th Virginia lost their colors. So we were able to capture that color as well, the 20th Virginia flag, and that's still in the Minnesota Historical Society collections.
At the conclusion of the battle, then, they had the Minnesota flag with only half of its staff, and they had the captured Virginia flag with a full staff. So who do you think decided to put these two things together, and what does it symbolize?
They did have the full length of the Virginia flagstaff, and they took the bottom half of that and spliced it together with the northern flagstaff, the 1st Minnesota regimental flag. And so they put nails, and then they took a knapsack strap and tightly wound that around the splice so you could have a little bit firmer hold. And so that flagstaff with the tatters or the remnants of that first Minnesota national color were used until they pretty much were disbanded in 1864. So it wasn't like put in a chest and put in the wagon and carried along. They were still using that flagstaff as they were marching or moving into campaigns and battles.
And do you think soldiers recognized the significance of having the staff from both the North and the South as part of their battle flag?
I think so. I think you're taking a part of the Southern story and you're taking the Northern story and putting that together. And for a lot of these men, that's why they joined to fight in the Army and to fight in the Civil War was to preserve the Union. So symbolically what you're doing is you're taking that Northern state and the Southern state and joining them together with the whole idea that someday we'll have reunion again.
Why is the flag bearer so important in battle?
That was an important part of the communication on the battlefield. You have to remember, there's no radios, there's no communication except couriers, and a general sending a message to another colonel or another officer of a regiment in the battle by a horse and rider or a foot soldier, whatever it might be. And so they needed to know where to send that message to the colonel. And so the flags not only were that center for those officers, but for the soldiers fighting shoulder to shoulder. So if you're kind of in the middle of a battle and you're trying to figure out where the flag is, and you can see it in front of you, it's like, well, I need to advance because the colonel says, or the officers have told us to move forward. If it's no longer in sight and it's behind us, we have to retreat. So for that soldier, you're fighting for the flag, but you're also looking for that flag for your directions on the battlefield as well.
Dramatic paintings of Civil War battles hang in the state capitol in the governor's reception room. Brian Pease offers a look at some of the famous artwork. The Minnesota Capitol is essentially a monument to the Civil War. And within this room, in the anteroom that you walk through, there are 6 striking paintings of Minnesota's contributions to the Civil War. How remarkable is it that there are these paintings of Minnesota's contributions in this space?
It really is a unique depiction of the Civil War of any state capitol that I'm aware of. You might have 1 or 2 paintings or things that will talk about the role those citizens had of a different state. Well, here, Gilbert knew he had to bring in the Civil War flags because those were always on display in the first 2 capitols. So that was a tradition you had to bring and incorporate back into this new building. But he also wanted this room to be pretty plain, kind of white enameled paint, very simple, kind of gilded, decorations. But he got pressure from the Minnesota Historical Society at the time and Civil War veterans to say, we've heard you talking about these allegorical paintings, that's good, but what about the events that we were a part of? We want those to be put in some place in the building. So Gilbert redesigned this entire room to reflect those Civil War paintings and 2 other paintings that were removed recently, just to remember those men who served in those battles of the Civil War.
One of the most famous battles of the Civil War is the Battle of Gettysburg, which is represented in this room in a painting by Rufus Zogbaum. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, it's an important part of American history because the men from the 1st Minnesota Infantry Regiment, the first 1,000 men that were tendered or offered to fight for the Union Army, and that second day of that 3-day battle were ordered to plug a gap in the Union line that had been opened up by advancing Confederate forces. And by 1863, they had been in war for 2 years, and they'd been in Antietam and Bull Run and been in major campaigns in the peninsula. So they lost a lot of men in that time period between 1861 and 1863. So their fighting force was pretty small speaking when you're looking at thousands of men in the battlefield. They had less than 300 men. And they knew when they got that order to plug that gap in the Union line, they had to fix their bayonets. It was basically a sacrificial charge. They just had to buy time for reinforcements. Not one man wavered or flinched. They all made that charge, bought the time they needed for the reinforcements to plug the gap, but they lost 82% of their men. So 8 of every 10 of them were either killed or wounded in that 15-minute charge. And so that was the one scene that you wanted to portray in your brand new capital, the sacrifice, not only of those men, but A lot of historians and even the generals at that time said if they hadn't made that charge, the whole outcome of the Civil War could have been completely different. So that was one of the defining moments of that battle. And of course, for those men that survived, a defining part of their life.
And another painting in here is the Battle of Nashville, which is known for being one of the most realistic portrayals of a battlefield scene. There's snow on the ground, the grass is downtrodden, there's smoke in the distance, the flags are in tatters. Tell me more about this painting.
Yeah, this is considered one of the masterpieces of any Civil War art in the world. And we have it here, and that's one of my benefits. I get to see it every day when I come to work. But it really is telling you a graphic story of what it was like to be in a Civil War battle. Howard Pyle, the artist, doesn't romanticize anything. He has, all the generals, all the officers are in the background. What he's portraying is those privates, the corporals, the sergeants who are making this charge across 400 yards of muddy cornfields. They were wading through that muck and the mire, getting to the Confederate defenses. And they were, once again, the 4 Minnesota regiments, the 5th, 7th, 9th, and 10th, had a pivotal part of that battle and helped push the Confederates out of their defenses outside of Nashville and help turn the tide of the battle. So when you look at this painting, it really gives you a graphic depiction of what these men were like and just the chaos. As you mentioned, the flags are shredded because there's hundreds of bullets zipping through the air, and the men are low to the ground to get under that waves of lead flying over their heads. And so when you look at, I'm sure a lot of these Civil War veterans were like, wow, this is pretty accurate depiction of what it would be like to be in one of those battles. And so Howard Pyle even is an artist who liked to put himself into the paintings. And so he is quoted as saying, when I painted that Battle of Nashville painting, I would often have to step outside my studio to clear my lungs of the smoke and the powder. So he was an artist who put himself in the middle of that scene. And when you look at the drama and the intensity of that depiction, it's almost like a photograph, 1 second of time where you see figures coming into the frame and out of the frame, kind of in a blurring motion. And so it really has a huge impact on what it was like to portray a Civil War battle.
You've been here for many years and thousands of people have come through this room. What do they take away?
I think the first thing they take away is the grandeur of the space. When they walk into the room, it's pretty impressive. And it's a place where the governor has an office, but it's also a place where he addresses the public. So it's a stately room. It's a place that has had governors from different states come here, presidents of the United States, foreign leaders have visited with the governors over time in this one room. And so it really is a show place to tell people about Minnesota. And I think every governor has had a lot of pride in being able to use this space for that purpose.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.